Hello and welcome to this special broadcast. WION has collaborated with Voice of America to bring you insights from the ground on global stories. And starting this broadcast with the biggest story, President Joe Biden wrapped up his European trip in Finland, meeting with NATO's newest member and other Nordic leaders as conflict in Ukraine casts a pall over the continent's future. VOA's White House Bureau Chief, Patsy Widakuswara, reports from Helsinki.
President Joe Biden swung through Finland's capital, assuring NATO's newest member of the alliance's commitment. He sought to calm European fears that a change in U.S. administration may mean uncertain transatlantic ties.
I absolutely guarantee it. There is no question. There's overwhelming support from the American people.
Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump, once called NATO obsolete, creating anxiety among allies. Now there are two more members of the alliance, with Sweden set to join soon. Finnish President Sauli Niinistö said the country feels more secure.
We have 80% of population supporting NATO membership and more than 80% who say that we will also protect our allies.
Protection from aggression by Russian President Vladimir Putin, whom Biden said already lost the war on Ukraine.
Putin has a real problem. How does he move from here? What does he do?
That's another departure from Trump, who met with Putin in Helsinki 5 years ago and said he believed Russia did not interfere in the 2016 U.S. election, despite U.S. intelligence evidence. In Helsinki, Biden also met leaders of other Nordic nations, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, who are all now NATO members. He returned to Washington Thursday evening. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Helsinki.
Now for the latest, we are being joined by our VOA correspondent, Jessica Stone. Welcome to the broadcast, Jessica. Part of the agenda at the US Nordic Summit was to deepen the partnership between the United States and Nordic countries on artificial intelligence and 5G. In that region, the unspoken US rival is, of course, China. Have we seen the US and Nordic countries advance strategies to impose greater limits on Chinese technology in the European wireless infrastructure yet?
Well, we are seeing every time the U.S. has a diplomatic endeavor around the world, they're increasingly bringing up this idea of national security concerns around Chinese technology. And we've seen that really at play, of course, in Europe. With respect to the Nordic countries in particular, the last month, the U.S. and Finland did come up with a strategy and a framework to partner on developing 6G, the next generation of technology for cell and for wireless calls. And, you know, Finland's Nokia and Sweden's Ericsson make natural partners in this because they are the main competitors to Huawei, which is the Chinese technology company about which the United States has so many national security concerns and which has a lot of projects and infrastructure throughout the world in wireless technology. Last month, we also know that Ericsson did take over from Huawei in Denmark in terms of supporting the wireless system there. And the company's president says that the overall atmosphere, the encouragement by the European Union leaders to disentangle and basically to replace European technology, wireless technology that relies on Chinese systems with European or Western systems, he says that's really going to help the company. So that's what we're looking at going forward. And yes, this EU leadership is creating a debate throughout Europe about replacing this technology because, of course, it's costly and it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a while. This more broadly for the U.S. strikes at the heart of its effort to cut off China from semiconductor chips and from semiconductor chip making technology, both from the U.S. and from around the world. And what's interesting there is that we did see Huawei, which is also in the smartphone realm, makes smartphones. They just came out with the idea that they are now going to be able to once again produce a cell phone with Chinese-made semiconductor chips, so showing that they have some level of independence from the U.S. systems and from the Western semiconductor manufacturing. That's important, of course, because they have been banned in the United States from wireless technology and from wireless cell phone sales. And at one point 3 years ago, that was said they were on survival mode, they said. And so now we're seeing them come back to the marketplace, not in the United States, but elsewhere around the world with a Chinese-made semiconductor chip at the core of their product.
Right, Jessica. Now, a congressional committee known as the U.S. Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party held a hearing on the growing risks of American companies operating in China late Thursday. Did we learn anything new from that?
Not a lot new there, no, Ananya, but we did see the experts give extensive testimony on the ways in which China is throwing up walls to foreign direct investment. This has been a focus among the American business community, and of course it was a focus when U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen recently went to China. She met with American companies operating in China. She underscored concerns that they have with Chinese officials about the difficulties around the counter-espionage law and what it will mean to foreign direct investment, about other things that are coming out of the federal government and Xi Jinping's policy that make it more difficult for the Chinese market to be somewhere that American companies want to operate. And in particularly, these witnesses talked about how data is becoming increasingly unreliable in China, that you can't trust economic data, you have very little visibility on competitive data, and even trying to collect that data can be construed by the Chinese government as a violation of their counter-espionage law. And of course, all of this is coming at a time when we are watching the Chinese economy retract, we are watching exports go down, and the Rhodium Group just reported that the FDI into China dropped from $100 billion in the first quarter of last year to $20 billion this year. That goes in tandem with what we're hearing from the American Chamber of Commerce in China, specifically doing a survey earlier this year where a majority of the companies surveyed no longer say that China is the primary destination for their investment. It's not even in the top 3.
All right, Jessica, stay with me. We will need your inputs on another very big story coming in from the U.S. Now, 18-year-old American citizens of the Gen Z generation will be eligible to vote in a U.S. presidential election for the first time next year. Voice of America's Veronica Iglesias interviewed several young adults about what political and legal issues are important to them.
Generation Z, or people born starting around 1996, is a more racially and ethnically diverse group than previous generations. As young adults, Zoomers, as they are colloquially known, tend to lean towards liberal politics, but they aren't a monolith.
They tend to put party affiliation to the side and focus on the policy issues in particular.
University students who will be eligible to vote in the 2024 presidential election say they are keeping an eye on how politicians react to a series of conservative decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court, including those on abortion rights and college admissions.
Because the way that it's going right now, we're getting pushed back like 100, 150 years into the past because of issues like Roe v. Wade being turned over, affirmative action being turned over, LGBTQ rights.
Preston Raven, a journalism sophomore in Austin, Texas, was comfortable with the court's recent decision to end race-conscious admissions in colleges.
They should look at your application and base it off of that, not because of your race. Even though I am a person of color, I just think everyone should be equal.
Women's rights and economic policies could sway Elizabeth Andrews' vote, she said.
Definitely abortion rights were very high on my mind during the last year, and student loans, of course.
It's too early to tell, however, if and how the Gen Z vote could impact the results of the 2024 general election.
A 20-year-old versus a 45-year-old, the 45-year-old's going to have a higher likelihood of turning out to vote just because they're practiced at this and they understand how politics works a little bit better.
As she pondered the recent Supreme Court decisions, 20-year-old student Oishi Mukhopadhyay wondered about the overall Gen Z turnout at the polls next year.
I definitely will be voting, but I think it's a split issue with my peers because I do have some peers who believe that their vote doesn't count.
What can politicians do to change that perception?
What you want to do is sit down and talk to Gen Z voters. If we listen, they will tell us what concerns them.
Gen Z first-time voters, analysts pointed out, will also need guidance on how to register as they start to become familiar with the presidential election process in the U.S. Veronica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
Now, Jessica Stone is with us to give us more insights on this story. Jessica, the 2020 U.S. Capitol riots remain an election issue, especially because former President Donald Trump is running for the White House again. And this week brought new developments in our understandings. What happened on January 6, 2020, when he was still in the Oval Office? What can you tell us?
Well, we are getting bits and pieces because the investigations continue both at the Department of Justice and within the U.S. Congress. What we saw this week is that the FBI Director Christopher Wray was on Capitol Hill taking questions about what happened on January 6th, as well as other issues within the department. But one of the things he was asked about was this bipartisan Senate report that basically says that the FBI and Homeland Security either missed or ignored warnings about specific intelligence that would have made them more prepared to handle the violence that ultimately took place that day. At issue there is a specific tip that came in December of 2020, so 1 month before the actual events of January 6th happened, that there was a far-right extremist group who had promised through its channels to, quote, literally kill people on January 6th in Washington. Now, Wray, for his part, says that the notion that anyone in the FBI either enabled or orchestrated or incited the riots on January 6th is that those thoughts are essentially, quote, ludicrous. He did refuse to say, though, how many people were working for the FBI or were in contact with the FBI that were there that day. Separately, we also saw this week that a former Marine who was there during January 6th, the man by the name of Ray Epps, he has sued Fox News for defamation. He is a Marine that at least 3 Fox hosts brought up as someone who was an FBI informant that day and potentially had something to do with causing or inciting the riots that happened that day. He says he was not a government informant, that he was not working for the FBI, and that he has now, due to defamation and the words of these Fox News hosts, had to leave his property and essentially move elsewhere and is hiding out currently. So there's a couple of new developments there. That was a largely advanced conspiracy theory that was advanced by quite a few people on the right, that basically the FBI was behind the events of January 6th. Ananya?
Right now, also next week, we are expecting to see President Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, back in the news. 2 whistleblowers who accuse the U.S. government of impeding their tax fraud investigations of President Joe Biden's son will testify on the Capitol Hill, what took place there. What's at the heart of this, Jessica?
So at the heart of this is that we often see congressional investigations escalate during an election year. And of course, we have the House Republicans very active on that front. They are calling witnesses around the allegations surrounding tax fraud, which Hunter Biden, one of the sons of President Joe Biden, has already pleaded guilty to 2 tax fraud charges. But the allegation here is that 2 members of the Internal Revenue Service, which is the taxing authority in the United States, were investigating him, and that essentially they are claiming that their investigation was impeded, was slow-walked by prosecutors because of who Hunter Biden is, of who he is connected to. They have testified it already in front of one House committee. They are now being invited to do so publicly, face-to-face, in person, in front of a second next week. So we'll get that testimony next week. And separately, the Justice Department has also indicted a man described by Republicans as a reliable whistleblower. So we're seeing these allegations about whistleblowers around the Biden family go back and forth. Congressional Democrats calling for an investigation into that case. And none of these congressional investigations, of course, will lead or are criminal, but they could lead to criminal allegations if the facts bear out. And so we're going to see an uptick of this type of activity here in the U.S. government, taking up congressional time in the interest of getting more information on all the potential candidates. And of course, we have 2 people running who ran 4 years ago, both lightning rods of sorts for their opponents. And so we don't expect this to quiet down anytime soon.
Absolutely, and all these elements will pan out given that the U.S. presidential election is months away, but then of course you have to, in a way, get on with your campaigning of sorts. So thank you so much for all those insights, Jessica Stone, and getting us all those insights.